I mean, they just don't have turnover.
It was crazy though, because they had so many things. It was like such a nice place to, like.
Yeah, the sacred rules like that.
All right.
But when you work for Google, you're expected to work until like the wee hours of the morning.
Really? Sounds like an exciting place to work.
Buy you dinner, but then you have to work until 10.
I mean, like, they could have had the people who were being interviewed, like,
Here's your break. Have fun.
Yeah.
All right, back to work.
You know, they had like, the doctors and stuff, they interviewed the manager, and they're like, they cost more money, but it's like token, they get it taken care of, like, the first 2 weeks, so they have, like, less sick rates and everything.
Maybe they give you Girl Scout stuff.
They won't give me any. Where I am.
All right, let's go back and do a couple more parts of sociocultural perspectives. You know, again, we're not going to be able to cover everything. So if you find something that you really like, run with it and pursue it more. I do want to make sure we talk about Anthony Giddens and structuration. So who knows about Anthony Giddens and structuration already? Structuration, adaptive structuration, Matthew Scott Poole. No, all right, we're okay. I can do this. All right, so there is a British...
Sure? Like,
what's that?
What you were asking?
What?
Like, you weren't sure?
Well, I don't know what you already know.
Oh, I thought you, like, weren't sure about it, so in case you told us wrong stuff, like, we didn't know we would...
Well, that's interesting. I made an utterance. That was a proposition, and you took it as a...
The way you asked, I thought, okay.
No, it's good. I can say whatever I want to say, and you don't know what's going on. No, I don't think so. Let me clarify that was an actual question. Did he have a question down there? I don't remember. Inquiry. It was a speech act of inquiry. No, I didn't want to go over something you already knew. All right, there's a British sociologist by the name of Anthony Giddens, who's a somewhat famous guy. He's alive today. He's been an advisor to Tony Blair and various other British political people. If I'm right, also the Democratic Party of the United States got him to write them a book recently about sociological analysis. So that's a little weak. I may not be right about that, but otherwise I'm right. And Anthony Giddens was interested in the question of how is it that social systems have stability but they can change? That was his question. So a society or a culture has stability, it persists over time, but it also changes over time. So how does that work, was his question. Why is that the case? What gives it its stability? What enables it to change? And he came up with what he called a structurational perspective, which is a general theory of social action that said society and human action form an interactional relationship. And this is, not rocket science once you think of it, but someone had to think of it first. That society shapes people's actions, and that people's actions shape society. So there is an interaction. So there's stability because society shapes the human action. So everybody who comes into the world and into society doesn't just make up their own world and society. There's some stability that goes on because you're shaped by, you get language, you get rules, you get rituals, you get identities from the culture. At the same time, you have a certain degree of agency. You are not fully determined by the social system. This is the determinism versus free will debate. And there are people who would argue that humans are fully determined, that there is very little agency. You have very little room to make any individual statements or change. Probably Foucault at some points would be kind of a deterministic model. But Giddens wanted to say it's this complex back and forth interaction that goes on where people can't fully change the society, but they can band together with others and make some changes that then persist in society and then get passed on, reproduced in the next people who come along.
Is it like when we're talking about like homogeny and countercultures? Like one of the agency would be like the countercultures, but then sometimes the counterculture becomes the mainstream.
Well, that's what's that called? Co-optation, when the mainstream co-opts the counterculture and begins to use it in the reproduction of false consciousness. That's cultural studies, yeah, which is kind of a critical theory. I'm trying to remember where we did that. We did that?
Yeah, we did it before we started doing each tradition.
Yes.
Before we broke each one down.
That would have been a review of critical theory, yeah. Yeah, I don't know that Giddens would say, is that about co-optation? He's got a more general theory. It's a more general look, saying that we have to recognize that individuals are not fully determined by the system, but that the system is not able to be fully changed by the individual agent. So there's this constant movement between the individual and the agent. And so this is a sociocultural approach to things, to stability in society, that we produce and reproduce each other. Society produces and reproduces us, we produce and reproduce society. So it goes back and forth. The way this works out in organizational studies is Marshall Scott Poole, brought this over and applied it to organizations, the study of organizations. And he calls it their adaptive structuration theory, which says that when your organization, you will have a certain culture that exists in the organization. When you get there, you come on board, there are rules, there are rituals, there are repeated patterns, there are identities that people have, and you will be shaped by that. At the same time, your uniqueness and your behaviors will affect that. And so there will be this constant reciprocal interaction of formation and reproduction.
I guess that maybe the shaping and the reshaping are more obvious when people gather, when they already have separate backgrounds, for instance, and they gather spontaneously and they're already predetermined but in a different way, and then they all contribute to shaping the group, and then they're shaped in return. Right?
As long as you keep the circular interconnectedness is going, you're within this theory, right? Yeah, so people can band together to try to make changes, but in his view and in a sociological view, the complexity and the multi-connectedness of society is such that you're not likely to just change it, all at once. That you're going to be able to reshape some things that may stick, and then that'll continue to reshape people over time.
What about I guess it would be like drastic situations, but like in a company where they might get like a new president, and like drastically changes stuff, or like maybe in governments where they're like overthrows and stuff like that.
Yeah.
What happens with the people? Do they like if they keep fighting it and nothing, like if and they don't get any change, do they stop it or do they just continue?
Well, the language there in organizational change is the question of revolution versus reformation, which is sometimes the difference between radicalism, radical change, and gradual change. So change can take place in different ways in a society or in an organization. You can have a revolution which attempts to make a radical root change, and enforce a lot of changes. I think Giddens would say that that's an uphill battle that you're likely to be losing.
We were just talking the other class, and I think it was within cybernetics, and talking about the differences between the formal structure of a company and the informal structure.
Right.
So what you're referring to maybe would be some changes at the formal structure of your organization.
Yeah,
The informal would not change.
Right. Giddens would say that. He would say that this is so persistent because it's built into the identities of people that you may have somebody who says, well, we're all new now, we're all going to change it differently. And on the outward level it may change, but they would probably say it in the inward it's still going along the same way. Another approach to change is to try to leverage processes internally so that the change is taking place inside and then eventually shows up in the macro system, so that people begin to function differently and eventually they say, oh, we're different. But it came from the inside out rather than the outside being enforced in. But there are theories, again, this depends. There are some places where you need we were talking about half of your people leaving or whatever. If you have half your people leave, you may be doing some radical changes because this whole structure, there's not that much holding the same structure in place. Right? So if you shoot everybody who was part of the old culture, and you make a new culture, you can maybe do it.
I know, even certain things, at small level concepts, big companies, but police departments and stuff, they'll get a new chief, and the chief will change procedures, they'll change who works together, the times that they work and everything, and sometimes people like it and other times they hate it.
Right.
And one or two people different rules and stuff that might not, will come up and they'll try to fight it, but if they keep getting knocked down, then sometimes people don't know, after a while there's people kind of just give, I remember in history class them saying after a while you kind of just give up.
Right.
But I wanted to, or do they change, maybe not fighting it that way, but do they change it a different, or does that always keep going? You know what I mean?
Well, I think Giddens would say that this, whatever is, persists because people have been formed by it. It's their identity, that's who they are. They consider themselves, this is part of who I am. And so when you introduce change, there's resistance to it because I don't necessarily want to change unless I'm dissatisfied with myself. And so change consultants will talk about organizational readiness for change. That you can assess an organization's readiness for change, which would be some measure of their dissatisfaction with is the current dissatisfaction powerful enough to propel people through the identity changes that they need to make. But if someone is strong enough to persist in the change long enough and people accept it, then it becomes the change and it becomes the difference. So this becomes Giddens' theory of structuration, social structuration becomes an organizational communication theory under Marshall Scott Poole about how organizations change. And organizational change is a big question these days, because one way to look at it is through the learning organization model, which says that your best shot at changing is changing the processes that people are engaged in. And as people become used to learning and learning together, then the change will just emerge out of the new learnings and behaviors that they do. So it's a distributed change model rather than a up-down change model. There are two theories also about group and organizations in this book, at least the way he does it here, that he calls sociocultural. And that's the functional theory and groupthink theory. This is page 239 and 241 in your book. Functional theory is Randy Hirakawa, who argues that as a unit, groups have to perform certain functions together in order to accomplish their task effectively. So Randy Hirakawa and his associates asked the question, when do groups of people make the best decisions? Can we identify how people make better decisions than not? And they did some studies and they found out that if 4 functions are performed by a group, there's a 60 to 70% chance that they will make a better decision than a group that doesn't follow these 4 functions. So it became known as the functional theory of group decision making. I suppose Littlejohn makes it sociocultural because it involves a group doing it together. So this functional theory by Hirakawa comes out of John Dewey's views about how people think and how people solve problems. So I don't know if you've ever had in any of your courses a look at John Dewey's stages in problem solving. I don't know if you've ever taken educational theory, you understand that Dewey was a leader in making a shift, a change in education from a rote learning and memorization. There was a time when education was carried on by repeating stuff, rote learning and memorization. And then we got a change into problem solving as the way you would learn. So we present problems, you ask questions, you inquire, you study. And this change in educational psychology, it relates to John Dewey and his work at the University of Chicago, where he argued that what we need are not people who just learn things, but who learn how to think and solve problems. A little bit of World War, I'm going to say World War I, but a little bit of the war stuff in here about the idea that why can you get groups of people to behave in irrational ways? And part of the answer for Dewey was that they never learned to think. They just learned to repeat stuff and follow stuff. So Dewey wanted to create a society of people who knew how to think and solve problems. So he suggested that there were a number of things that had to happen for this to go on. And so he had this 4 steps. And Hirakawa took these and applied them to group decision making and then studied it as a research model and found out that if a group does these 4 things, they will 60 to 70% of the time make a better decision than a group that doesn't do these 4 things. So the first one was, and these are in your book, that you have to identify and assess the problem. This is not as easy as it appears to be, to identify the problem, because there are alternate ways to conceptualize any problem. So for instance, Montclair has a parking problem, right? So what is the problem?
Not enough spaces.
Okay. So one possibility is there's not enough spaces. That's our problem. Anyone want to offer an alternate conceptualization of the problem?
Too many permits to hand out.
Okay. That we over-enroll. We got too many permits.
Not enough funding?
Okay. Inadequate funding for what would we do with the funding?
Extra building, extra funding.
Funding for more parking?
Maybe a willingness on people's part to walk. I think, at least, I think that plays a part.
Walk, inadequate mass transit.
Too many commuters.
So I can walk from far parking lots, not like from their houses.
Right. I mean, I went to State University of New York at Stony Brook. The parking lots were 2 miles away. We parked there and we bussed into campus. You know, that's the way we did it. And that's the way it went. You never drove onto campus. But anyway, so part of what Dewey would say to a group is that you have to take time to identify and assess the problem that you're working on. Because the way you define the problem makes a huge difference in how you go about solving the problem, right? So if the problem is inadequate funding, then our problem is to find out how to get more funding, right? If the problem is over-enrollment, the problem is how do we meet our goals but not enroll too many people?
What if there are several problems, causes for the same problem?
I don't know. I think he would probably say you have to work with root problems, you know.
So some of them could be like, you know, because of other things, you know, like this is all because of this, it kind of trickle down.
Well, yeah, if you can find a root problem to it. I mean, there would be people who say the root problem is that our students won't ride bikes, won't walk, and won't take shuttle buses.
But like the unwillingness to walk from the lots relates to inadequate mass transportation.
Right. Yeah, if we designed a thing where there were roving vans continually, you know, that took people, it wouldn't be a problem.
Is this all going to crumble if people can't agree on what the problems are?
Well, yeah, I mean, you can't go further until you agree on the problem, because then you gather information. You know, you really know these things. You gather information, evaluate it, you propose alternatives, you evaluate between the alternatives, you make a choice. And then you evaluate, and then you repeat the cycle. So Hirakawa did studies, and he videotaped groups making decisions, and then he seeded some groups with this idea that make these decisions, do it this way, or do these things. Because you move back and forth. Sometimes when you gather information, you redefine the problem. But Hirakawa found out that if he could get groups to do these 4 things, in whatever order they wanted to do them, that they would make better decisions as a group.
I missed 3 and 4, I'm sorry.
3 was propose alternative solutions, which is basically what we talk about brainstorming, you know, do this, do that. You know, instead of settling on one solution too early. You know. I mean, the classic story about this is the Canadian power line problem, where they were having a problem. The snow would accumulate and ice would accumulate on power lines would fall down. They'd send out repair guys, and it was so desolate out there that they'd get attacked by wolves and bears and things. You know, they were losing repairmen to the wildlife. So they're like, what are we going to do? You know, and then someone says, oh, we can give them all rifles, you know, or we can send them out in twos and do this and that thing. And someone else said, well, you know, we could just fly over the lines with helicopters, you know, and the air will beat the ice off the lines, you know. And it was like, yeah. But they kept it on the board, and they thought about it more, and eventually said, well, you know, it makes a lot of vibration when it goes by. Let's try it, you know. And they did, and it worked. You know, so they didn't have to send out people. They flew over it. So instead of waiting for the lines to come down, they flew these helicopters over and shook the ice off them, and they didn't have that problem. So for Hirakawa, that's a story where if you had settled on the shoot the bears solution too quickly, you would never think of an alternate. So you need alternate.
I was gonna say, with like the space program, they couldn't get a pen right, so they spent all this money and they made space pens. you know what they are. Like you can, if you write like this.
Okay, yeah.
But like, and then because it was like during the space race, and then they were like, like when they combined with Russia, they just used like pencils. But they were so intent on the fact
pens.
that pens,
Yeah, right.
markers didn't work that they didn't even like stop to think
Right.
what else could we use.
Yeah, Hirakawa would say that's a failure to do adequate process. And it costs money in some cases. Right. Out of this also comes Irving Janis's groupthink theory, which is the idea that groups will not always engage in all of these things for various reasons. And Irving Janis studied cases where groups closed down their decision-making process and stuck on one solution and wouldn't listen to anybody else and wouldn't take any advice and closed off themselves and made bad decisions. So the example of this is
Tire fire.
the tire fires.
We learned about
Yeah.
semester where they, to resolve the excess tires, they would put them all together in one big clump, but then fires would start.
Yeah, then they would start. Yeah, so we're stuck in a way of thinking. So we've got excess tires, we pile them all up, they catch on fire, we put the fire out, and then we keep piling them up. We're not thinking creatively here, we're not thinking outside of the box. Part of the reason we don't do it is because we're feeling pressure, we're feeling internal anxiety, and so we don't want to make other people in the group feel bad, so we stay with it. And so things that disrupt good decision-making processes in groups. Irving Janis studied. He studied the government in the Bay of Pigs Cuban invasion, and he studied that, and that everyone in the room around the decision-making process had already in mind one solution, and they didn't entertain other possible solutions. Whereas in the Cuban Missile Crisis, they realized this problem, and they invited in people who had other perspectives on it. And they deliberately brought in new perspectives and gave them time to talk. So that is regarded as an example of breaking out of groupthink and doing. The Challenger space disaster has been studied this way, the shuttle disaster, where the launch of the thing and then the thrusters blew up. It was 86. Yeah. The decision-making process leading up to that was studied. And it was found that there were people who said no, but they were silenced by the pressure of, we have to launch, we haven't launched twice, we look like idiots to the country, the press is here, we have to do this, so you engineer, be quiet, we're going to sign off on it, we're not going to listen to you. That engineer put in a memo saying, I don't agree with this, we don't have the data for this, and then it blew up, right? So.
In my psychology book, there was a whole chapter on it, and one of the things they talked about, back when Ford was still alive, Ford Motor Company, he had an idea. I don't remember if it was for a new car or what it was, but he had his executive meeting, and I think there were 12 people in the room, and he suggested an idea, and everyone thought it was a really good idea. So he had everyone go around the room and say why they thought it was a different idea, and no one could repeat the same thing. And then afterwards, he had everyone go around and say why it was a bad idea, and no one could think of a bad idea, so he refused to do it. And he goes, if we can't think of until we can come up with at least 12 bad ideas, we won't do it, because he felt that if you couldn't think of anything, when people are in groups, they always think it's a good idea. So then they're not looking at it objectively.
Right. There are studies of groups where they call it risky shift, where if you have a group of people together, they're more likely to do something risky than individually they would do, because they feel like they can pass it off to someone else. Right, so that responsibility is diffused. So this is a sociocultural theory of group process. A lot of theories about what goes on in groups, how people affect each other in their interactions. So that's very useful for you. Let's finish up tonight with some media theories on Marshall McLuhan and Max McComb. You know, I don't know why these guys all have M names. Marshall McLuhan, Max McComb. I don't know. But anyway, they do. So Marshall McLuhan was the guy who had the idea that the medium is the message. Does anybody want to try to unpack that?
Well, he was a technological determinism, was that?
Technological determinism, right.
Well, he said that the medium carries a message itself. Besides the actual message that is transmitted through